let's start. And if everyone could please mute themselves, that would be great. My name is Margaret Home, and I'm a board member with First Things First Okanagan, coming to you from Penticton. I'd like to begin the evening by acknowledging that we're in the Okanagan Valley, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. Right now, if you go for walks along the channel, which many of us do, you can see a wonderful Syilx land stewardship project right here. It's called Kemcheniqua, meaning alongside the water, and it's a floodplain re-engagement project. It's an eco-community place at the Penticton Reserve. What they're doing is the natural floodplain, which has been separated by a concrete channel, they are restoring it. They're reconnecting the Okanagan River channel to allow seasonal flooding, which is going to renew habitat for salmon and all kinds of other species. This is going to strengthen the indigenous foods, the medicine, the access to natural materials. It's also going to ensure the protection and create new important riparian habitat for wildlife in this area. And it's going to build climate resilience in our community by giving us back a place where spring floodwater can go rather than flooding into the lakes. So the Kemcheniqua project is looking for volunteers to help plant 50,000 indigenous trees, shrubs, and flowers that they have grown in their greenhouses. They have over 1 million indigenous plant seeds that are going to go into this new floodplain restoration area. These have been collected and grown by the Anauken Center staff. So if you'd like to volunteer for a few hours or a few days, planting within your bubble, they've figured out how it can be done safely. Just respond in the chat, put volunteer and your email, and we'll send you the information in a couple of weeks. They're going to be planting this restoration project later in April. So it's a wonderful example of the Syilx people in our region protecting their culture and also protecting our climate resiliency. On to our program. Tonight's deep dive, it's hosted by First Things First Okanagan. We're a 6-year-old nonprofit organization. Our mission is to promote awareness of climate change and to work to find solutions for a better future. This is our 6th deep dive Zoom discussion. We want to invite people to talk from around BC, and we hope to gain insight into what we can accomplish here in the Okanagan. Tonight's session, it's being recorded, so it's going to be posted on a YouTube channel. We'll send you the link, and if you want to watch it again or send it to your friends, you'll be able to do that. I'm going to introduce fellow board member Sue Kirschman a little later in the evening after Seth's talk. And there'll also be time for your questions. And we're going to give away a book, so stay tuned and stick around. I'm going to turn things over to Lori Goldman. You might have seen her already. She's usually on a Friday waving a climate sign in front of City Hall. She's our much valued Zoom technician, and she's our social media maven. Lori's going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be introducing Seth tonight. Welcome to everyone. And the reason I'm so excited is because Seth is kind of a hero to me. I've been following him for years. He's been busy for decades fighting for climate action and a just society. For those of you who aren't familiar with his work, Seth was a founding director of the BC Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, the CCPA, where he chaired the group for 22 years, leading important research on environmental, economic, and social justice and informing government policies. He's been concerned about climate change and the need for clear and immediate policies for years, showing that alternatives are possible. He currently serves on the board of Dogwood, which champions climate solutions. He's a founder, advisor, instructor for Next Up, a Canada-wide leadership program for young people committed to social and environmental justice. So, Seth is our researcher, a writer, a consultant, a speaker, an adjunct professor with SFU Urban Studies, all while raising kids and writing books in Vancouver. And tonight, Seth will be introducing his book, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency, looking at positive solutions that Canada could take right now. It's been called a blueprint for rapid societal transformation that we've all been waiting for, and the roadmap out of climate crisis. And Libby Davis, former NDP MP, says it's a climate emergency manifesto that brings it all together: history, politics, economics, humanity, mobilization, and science, with the wisdom of the actions we must undertake to win this good war. And before I pass it over to Seth, I just want to remind you to put any questions into the chat, and we'll try to get to them later on in the evening. And I'd like to pass it over to Seth.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you very much for that introduction. Am I coming through okay? Great. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for your interest and for joining this event. I'm a bit I'm surprised to see so many of you on a Thursday evening after Zoom fatigue notwithstanding. I'm joining you with gratitude from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, otherwise known as East Vancouver. And yeah, very happy to have some time with you this evening. I've been asked to offer some opening comments about the book, so I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then looking forward to lots of Q&A with you. Here's the book, by the way. Case well, I hope you pick it up if you haven't already. I put a link to my book page in the chat, and there's some links there to for how to order it, but the best thing is to get it from your local independent bookstore. So my belief is that the book calls on us to adopt an entirely new and different approach to the climate crisis than the one that we've pursued to date. And the book endeavors to tell the truth about the severity of the crisis that we face. But ever since releasing it last September, the feedback that I've had from people is that they are finding it an unusually hopeful book, notwithstanding the subject matter. And the book's original twist, as the title suggests, is that it is structured entirely around lessons from the Second World War. I always like to start by saying that there's no small irony in me coming to this place. And like many of you, I'm sure, I also wrestle with the war analogy. My own political activism started as a teenager in the peace and disarmament movement in the 1980s. I am actually the child of Vietnam War resistors. That is how I happen to be Canadian. But I am nevertheless now strongly of the view that climate breakdown requires a new mindset to mobilize all of society and galvanize our politics and to fundamentally remake our economy. And here's why. In fact, I should have checked earlier if I'm able to, oh, I can't share my screen unless someone makes me a co-host. And if that, Lori, I don't know how fast you can do that, or it's not vital. I can just move along if you would like. Oh, you've done it. So here, have a look at this. Are you seeing my blue chart there? Yeah? That is Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back the last 20 years. And if I were to show you the same chart for British Columbia, it basically looks the same, which is to say it's kind of a flat line, little ups and downs year to year. But in the parlance, to put this in the parlance that we have all come to know in the pandemic, we have failed to bend the curve. We have simply plateaued the curve. And so my contention that I open the book with is that everything that we have been doing in response to the climate crisis so far is simply not working. That despite decades of calls to action, our emissions are simply not on a path to stave off a horrific future for our children and future generations. We've run out the clock with these distracting debates about incremental changes, but where it matters most, actual GHG emissions, we've accomplished precious little. And so here we all are, all of us who are increasingly alarmed about the climate emergency, confronting this harrowing gap between what the science says we must do and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. Now, I didn't actually start off planning to write a war story. My book project began as an exploration of how to tackle that gap, of how we can align our politics and economy in Canada with what the science says we must urgently do. And the book is that. But in the initial book outline, I had actually only had a single chapter on lessons from the Second World War, because I'd long been intrigued by World War II as an example of rapid economic transformation. But as I delved into that research, I began to see more and more parallels between our war experience and the current crisis, and ultimately decided to structure the entire book around lessons from our wartime experience, because I see in this history this helpful and hopeful reminder that we've done this before. We have mobilized in common cause across society to confront an existential threat. And in doing so, we actually have retooled our entire economy twice, once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert back to peacetime, all in the space of a few short years. And so the book explores what wartime scale climate mobilization could actually mean and look like. And each chapter jumps back and forth in time between stories of what Canada did in the war and what we now face. And in these comparisons, it answers questions like, how has public opinion rallied to support mobilization in the war? How might it be galvanized again? What was the role of government, news media, arts, and culture? How was social solidarity secured across class and race and gender then? And how can we do so again? How was national unity established across Canada's many provinces with their varying interests? And can we successfully achieve that again as we move off fossil fuels? How did we marshal all of our resources to produce what was needed? How do we do that again? How did we pay for that transformation? And can we mobilize the necessary finances again? Interestingly, what supports were offered for returning soldiers, and is there a model there for just transition for fossil fuel workers today? What was the role of Indigenous people in the war? What is it in today's transformation? What was the role of youth and social movements then and now? And importantly, while the book, most of the book is lauding what Canada did in the war, there are a couple of chapters about the war's cautionary tales, the warnings of things that brought us shame, the internments, the squashing of civil rights, the poisoning of Indigenous lands, and I think most apt to the current crisis, the response to refugees. So those things that we don't want to repeat. And running through it all, what sort of political leadership do we require to see us through challenges like this? And I begin the book with one important comparison that I think gives me some hope, and it's this, which is that despite Canada's war declaration in September of 1939, it's worth recalling that even as the winds of war gathered in the late 1930s, our leaders and much of the public were actually reluctant to recognize what would ultimately be necessary. A lot like today. Canada was on the cusp of being completely transformed by its Second World War experience, yet right up to the 11th hour, our government and most of the public still hoped to avoid getting dragged into that fight. And I feel like that's where we find ourselves again today, in this awkward period where, 2 summers ago, the federal government passes a climate emergency motion in the House of Commons one day, and then proceeds with reapproving the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion the very next day. That's a dynamic that I refer to as the new climate denialism at play. It's a concept that I unpack in the book. But as with the Second World War, I'm convinced that this phony war period isn't going to last, that it is in fact about to end. Ever since releasing the book in September, I've done a lot of events like this. I've done a lot of media interviews, and invariably I get asked, how do you know when a government gets the emergency? And I've been forced in answering that question to distill this 400-page book into what I call 4 markers of when you know that a government has shifted into an emergency mode. And I'm going to share them. I wrote them up in a little article in November for Policy Options, which I'll put a link to in the chat when I'm done talking. But here's what the 4 markers are. Firstly, it spends what it takes to win. Second, it creates new economic institutions to get the job done. Third, it shifts from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures as needed. And fourth, it tells the truth. about the severity of the crisis and communicates a sense of urgency about the measures necessary to combat it. And when you reflect on those four markers, during the Second World War, the Canadian government did all of those things. And likewise, I would say that in response to the pandemic we've been through this year, the Trudeau government actually passes all four markers. But with respect to the climate emergency, so far anyway, neither our federal government nor any provincial government hits any of the four markers. So I want to explore a little bit more of those four markers with you, as well as a couple other lessons that I draw from our Second World War experience before we open this up. But in the book, I group all of these lessons into what I call the battle plan for climate mobilization. And it's a 14-point plan outlining what it looks like to adopt an emergency mindset and do what it takes to win. I'm not going to go through all 14 points. Don't worry, that would take too long. But I want to highlight a few, starting with those four markers. So marker number one, spend what it takes to win. A benefit of an emergency mentality is that it forces governments out of an austerity mindset. So think about that this year. In response to the COVID emergency, Canada's debt to GDP ratio is going to rise from about 30% to 50%. That's a big jump in a single year. But at the end of the Second World War, it was over 100%, well over 100%, more than double that. And when C.D. Howe is this fascinating figure to me. He was the minister in the Mackenzie King government who oversaw all of Canada's military production. And when he was pressed about this tenfold increase in government spending, he famously replied, "If we lose the war, nothing will matter." And in order to finance the war effort, the government issued new public victory bonds and new forms of progressive taxation were instituted, including, by the way, a cap on profits. The kind of profiteering that we have seen in this pandemic was illegal in the Second World War. We can talk more about that later if you want. So I think as we confront the climate emergency, we're going to need to finance it using similar tools. But my point is that federal spending on climate action and green infrastructure pales in comparison to both what we did in the war and the pandemic response. Just to give you one more illustration. Since the first lockdown a year ago, the Bank of Canada has been buying up federal government securities in order to finance the emergency response to the tune of $5 billion a week. But if you tally up what the Trudeau government's spending on climate, it's $5 billion a year. So the Trudeau government and the Horgan government aren't merely spending a little less than they should in the face of the climate emergency. They are spending less by a massive order of magnitude. Marker two, create the economic institutions needed to get the job done. So I tell this story in the book about how during World War II, starting from a base of virtually nothing, the Canadian economy and its labor force pumped out a volume of military equipment that is simply jaw-dropping. During those 6 years, with a population less than a third what it is today, Canada produced 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined, 16,000 military aircraft, ultimately building the fourth largest air force in the world at the time. And here in our province, where we seem, to struggle these days to build a single BC ferry anymore, we produced over 300 ships in that time. Again, from a base of virtually nothing. And remarkably, the Canadian government, under the leadership of C.D. Howe, in order to get this job done, established 28 crown corporations. Howe was seized with the task. But let's be clear, he was no lefty, right? He was on the right wing of the Mackenzie King cabinet. He was a private sector guy. He'd made a lot of money in the private sector, but he was in a hurry. And anytime the private sector couldn't quickly do what needed doing, he created another crown enterprise. He undertook detailed economic planning to ensure that wartime production was prioritized. But in response to the climate emergency, we've seen nothing of this sort. So in contrast to all these wartime creations under Howe, the Trudeau government in its time in office has established two new crown corporations, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and you know what the second one is? I hate to tell you. It's the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation. It's the one that makes us all the proud owners of a 60-year-old oil pipeline from Alberta to our province. If our government really saw the climate emergency as an emergency, it would, like C.D. Howe did, quickly conduct an inventory of our conversion needs to determine how many heat pumps and solar arrays and wind farms and electric buses, etc., we're going to need to electrify virtually everything and end our reliance on fossil fuels. And then it would establish a new generation of public corporations, federal, provincial, municipal, Indigenous, to ensure those items are manufactured and deployed at the requisite scale. Marker 3, shift from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. So I showed you that chart off the top with our GHG emissions going back the last 20 years. Why has it merely flatlined? I think a big reason for that is that if you survey the federal and provincial climate policies to date, they all have they have one core thing in common. They're voluntary. We encourage change. We incentivize change. We offer rebates. We send price signals. What we have decidedly not done is require change. If we're going to meet the ambitious GHG reduction targets we now need to meet, we need to set clear near-term dates by which certain things will be mandated. For example, we would declare that you will no longer be allowed to sell or purchase a new fossil fuel vehicle as of 2025. We would mandate that all new buildings will not be permitted to use natural gas or other fossil fuels for heating as of next year. We would ban advertising by fossil fuel vehicles and gas stations. That's how we would make clear that this is serious. Which brings me to marker 4, tell the truth and rally the public at every turn. I think many of us assume that at the outbreak of the Second World War, everyone understood the threat and was ready to rally. That's not true. It took leadership to mobilize the public. And so in frequency and in tone, in words and in action, emergencies need to look and sound and feel like emergencies. The leaders that we most remember from the Second World War were these outstanding communicators who were forthright with the public about the gravity of the crisis and yet still managed to impart hope. And their messages were amplified by a news media that knew what side of history it wanted to be on, and by an arts and entertainment sector that was keen to rally the public. And similarly, again, we've all now lived through that this year, right? We've all had governments model what emergency communication looks like through this pandemic. The messages are ubiquitous. We receive daily press briefings. We hear regularly from public health officials. The media has taken its role seriously to provide us with necessary information on a daily basis. Government leaders and media listen to science and health experts. None of this consistency and coherence, however, is present with respect to the climate emergency. And when our governments don't act as if a situation is an emergency, or worse, when they send contradictory messages by approving new fossil fuel infrastructure, they are effectively communicating to the public that it's not an emergency. So if our current leaders believe we face an emergency, they need to act and speak like it's an emergency and name it and speak continuously about it, because that's what you do in a crisis. There's 2 other lessons I want to highlight before we open this up. One is that inequality is toxic to social solidarity and mass mobilization. This is a theme that runs through the book. There are a lot of climate policy purists out there who argue, don't link the need for climate action with inequality and all these social justice issues. Don't weigh it down. It's complicated enough as it is. And I think they're wrong. I think they're wrong for a couple of reasons. First of all, the issues of inequality and climate are inherently linked. The richer you are, the higher your emissions. The poorer you are as a household or community or country, the more vulnerable you are to climate change. But the main reason we should be linking these is because that's how we win. A successful mobilization requires that people make common cause across class and race and gender, and that the public have confidence that everyone's in, regardless of social class. During the First World War, just to go further back in history, inequality undermined social solidarity. It actually undermined recruitment efforts. And the Mackenzie King government was acutely aware of this. And so at the outset of the Second World War, they undertook bold steps to lessen inequality and to limit excess profits. They brought in Canada's first major income support programs during the war, unemployment insurance and the family allowance. The Marsh report, this historic report that laid the groundwork for the whole post-war welfare state, was written during the war and offered up to Canadians as a pledge that the country they would come back to would look different than the one they were leaving behind. That's when you see the cross-society mobilization. That's when they start hitting the recruitment numbers. And for me, there's an echo of this in the appeal we see today of the Green New Deal, linking tackling inequality with confronting the climate emergency. And the polling, and some of which I commissioned for the book, clearly shows that when we link ambitious climate action with tackling inequality, support for bold climate action doesn't go down, it goes through the roof. And the final lesson I'll mention is leave no one behind. To me, this comes down in particular to the issue of jobs. There's about 200 to 300,000 Canadians today directly employed in the fossil fuel industry. Now that's a lot of people, and we need to deal with that. But the comparison I make in the book is to consider this. In the Second World War, Canada had a population of about 11 million. Of that, over 1 million Canadians enlisted. It's remarkable. And over 1 million were directly employed in military production. Far, far more than are employed in the fossil fuel industry today. All of those people had to be recruited and trained up, and then after the war reintegrated into a peacetime economy, and we did that. We did it with these audacious income support programs and housing support programs and post-secondary apprenticeship and training programs. And if we could do that then, the task today is actually not as hard. I'll close with this. I believe that just as the Second World War ended the Great Depression, as we rebuild from this pandemic, an ambitious climate plan with massive green infrastructure spending, a Green New Deal, can be just what the economy needs. The vital and urgent challenge now is to ensure that we use this experience and the opening it creates to catapult our society into the post-carbon economy, to do as Arundhati Roy wrote early on in the pandemic, to use it as a portal or a gateway between one world and the next. But I want to highlight one important difference between the pandemic and this climate crossroads moment. People talk about COVID fatigue, and that's real. And some have responded to my thesis by saying, look how quickly we all tired of emergency in this pandemic. It's been less than a year, and now you're asking that we spend multiple years in emergency mode to tackle the climate crisis. But here's the distinction. The things that we have been called upon to do in response to the pandemic are anathema to all of our social instincts. We're told to isolate, to stay home, and that's hard. The good news about the climate mobilization is that it calls on us to do precisely the opposite, to get out there and do something grand together. And we can do that for a few years. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Seth, for inspiring us and for your carefully thought out climate action plan. You give me hope that collectively we can turn this climate ship around in time. A key part of achieving this is mobilizing citizens, as you've said, and the government, which is what our panelists will be speaking about. We asked them the question, do you see climate mobilization occurring in your community at the level that we need? Our first speaker, Victoria Ritchie, will give her perspective as a youth, followed by Jim Beatty, who is a longtime Okanagan activist. So Victoria is a coastal geography and environmental studies student at the University of Victoria. Her connection to nature started at a young age and is now a growing passion for intersectional environmental justice. Victoria is currently working and living on the lands of the Squamish Nation at the Nicholas Sontag Marine Education Center. Here she works as an animal care and education assistant, helping to deliver environmental and marine education to the public. Although studying and working in the field has helped her gain experience, Victoria gets much insight and inspiration from frontline actions. Whether it's solidarity initiatives, social justice issues, or the race against the climate crisis, Victoria finds herself drawn to the positive and revolutionary nature of direct action. Before Victoria begins, just a reminder, if you have questions for either of the panelists or for Seth, just pop them into the chat and we'll be having a little Q&A session after our speakers. So a big welcome, Victoria, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sue. Can you hear me well? Great. So like Sue said, my name is Victoria, and I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Squamish peoples, known to some as Gibsons, BC on the Sunshine Coast. I'm a geography and environmental studies student at the University of Victoria, and I'm currently working as an animal care education assistant at the Nicholas Sontang Marine Education Center. I'm hoping to provide a youth perspective on climate action and environmental mobilization, and I feel really privileged to be speaking alongside Seth Klein and Jim Beatty. Seth, I'm really excited about this book. I've been doing a lot of reading and reading a lot of reviews, and I'm going to be putting in my order soon, hopefully. And I want to thank you for coming out and speaking with some very passionate people about climate mobilization and giving us some insight into your complex world of thinking. I'll start by talking a bit about my academic life and some of the progressive changes that I'm seeing in my discipline that I believe will impact the way we fight climate change and work to better protect our natural world. Within the environmental science and geography realm, there's been a large push recently for more intersectionality. This shift comes at a time of heightened societal issues, discussions of privilege and power, as well as an elevated interest in Indigenous rights. When we fight for intersectional environmentalism, we are opening new doors within social justice. In fact, in today's world, you really can't discuss environmental impacts without discussing the social injustices linked to them, whether that be environmental racism, Indigenous sovereignty, or some of the global inequities that Seth touched on. So I think that it's important to highlight that young academics are seeing this, and we're trying to include it in our studies, our research, and our work moving forward. It is something that may be new for some folks, but I think that as we move forward and as we talk about mobilization, those overlaps between social justice and environmental justice really can't be talked about separately. A great example of these impacts is a cool initiative that I've been part of at the University of Victoria. I am a director at large on the student union and very involved with the Divest UVic group, which is a important lobbying initiative that's been going on for 7 years. So that's a long time of student advocacy. The group was formed as a result of disappointed UVic students, unhappy to hear that the money that we pay in tuition is in fact being invested into large oil and gas investments, as well as banking institutions that are upholding major industry projects such as TMX and the Coastal GasLink pipeline. So not only do these projects cause environmental damage, but these investments themselves are actively working against our future. 7 years of lobbying and many campaigns later, we are finally seeing a change. This past February of 2021, UVic moved their entire working capital, roughly $200 million, into a fossil fuel-free fund. That was a huge win for young activists and especially students at the University of Victoria. Not only does this win mean that our voices are heard, but it means that change is possible and opens up more opportunities for student input within our own investments. What really stood out to me about this specific situation is the relationship between students and university executives. While reading through financial statements and listening to appointed administration discuss the impossibility of clean investments, I was coming face to face with a lot of unjust power dynamics. It became very clear that the very entities that are teaching us about climate change, environmental injustices, and social inequalities are extremely non-transparent. They're apathetic and they're focused on monetary values over the future of students studying at their institutions. So with the continued efforts and lobbying initiatives with Divest UVic, I'm hoping to open up more doors to discuss with these higher up officials, as well as hopefully garner some more conversations surrounding fossil fuel-free investments in other areas. Through this type of lobbying, I've also gained skills that I use in my everyday job. I've learned how to better interpret environmental information and learn ways to navigate conversations between folks, leaving them passionate about climate action as opposed to pessimistic and apathetic. So that's an academic side for me that I've seen a huge shift in youth. And before I wrap things up and pass it over, I want to shed some light on BIPOC leadership, so Black, Indigenous people of color within the environmental movement. I'm a settler of European descent, and I feel it's really important to turn some attention to the young folks that are really leading this movement right now. Young people working for climate action are becoming more and more aware of the inequalities associated with environmental justice. Specifically right now, we're seeing a huge increase of criminalization of Indigenous peoples defending their own lands and waters. The rightful stewards of the places and spaces that we are occupying are being met with tremendous violence, and the Canadian government continues to commit cultural genocide against many sovereign and unceded Indigenous territories. So as I loop back to that idea of intersectional environmentalism, I want to point out that in order to be intersectional and to really unify all the voices that are very much so a part of this mobilization, we must first understand our privilege, how we can stand in solidarity, who's directly being impacted by these injustices, and some of the ways that these folks fighting on the front lines and against that system of power can be supported by our initiatives ourselves. So I'd like to end by giving you a few resources. The Braided Warriors are a group of Indigenous youth fighting the TMX pipeline project right now. It's currently invading Pequayum territories near Blue River, BC. And these land and water defenders stand in solidarity with the Tiny House Warriors, who've been conducting actions around BC in opposition to this destructive project. These young people have faced tremendous police violence and escalation at almost every action, something that me as a white woman within the environmental movement has never had to face. And so the criminalization of Indigenous peoples right now in Canada is something to pay attention to within the environmental movement. We saw it last year as well. The youth standing with Wet'suwet'en, the legislature in Victoria, they faced a lot of police violence. And I think this is a really important power dynamic to follow as we continue to work to mobilize against these large projects, against oil and gas, and turn our government's attention towards real solutions. So I'll put some links in the chat here to their Facebook pages, and you can learn more and donate if you can. And then I have a question for you, Seth, if this is the time to ask that. Sue, is that good? Yeah. Yep. So I talked a lot about intersectional environmentalism and some of the ways that youth are trying to do that within the environmental movement. And I'm wondering how, moving forward with your work and further discussing the keys to mobilization, how do you plan on including and uplifting marginalized voices, specifically those most often left out of the conversation due to economic, academic, or privilege-related boundaries?
Thanks, Victoria. First of all, that was excellent. Thank you for all of that. All excellent points. You're reminding everyone that when you think about how before the pandemic hit a year ago, momentum was really, really picking up on the climate emergency. And in particular, it was picking up because of this youth student-led global climate strike movement. And secondly, a few months after that, by what you just mentioned, these incredible national solidarity actions in support of the Wet'suwet'en. I'd never seen anything like either of those in my lifetime. And they were part of a shift in the terrain, I think. And the challenge coming out of the pandemic is going to be to regain some of that momentum. And as you say, that's where the leadership was coming from. It was coming from young people. And I talk about this in the book, that the kind of leadership we've had from young people and the almost just seamless way in which those young people have connected the dots between all of these struggles has been fantastic to watch. And then, my favorite chapter in the book actually is the Indigenous chapter. And part of what I'm arguing there, it's not one of it's among the key lessons, but not one of the ones that I mentioned tonight, was the central role of how the assertion of Indigenous rights and title is central to winning. And there is, I try to tell this, because every chapter is sort of 1/3 history, 2/3 present. I tell this story in the book about how the role of the Indigenous code talkers in the war, that the Allied forces ended up using these Indigenous language speakers from across North America because the fascist forces couldn't decipher their languages. They were referred to as the unbreakable code. And as I was researching that, I suddenly kind of had this dawning, isn't this incredible? Here are these, so tragically ironic, Here are these languages that both Canada and the United States have spent generations trying to expunge from the earth, literally beating out of children in residential schools, only to then discover that they were central to certain victories during the war. And then you fast forward to the present, and here we are in this era of the new climate denialism, where our governments dither and dodge on climate and incoherence. And in the face of that, over and over and over again, it has been the assertion of rights and title that's basically buying us time, blocking new fossil fuel infrastructure, slowing it down until such time as our mainstream politics finally comes into alignment with what the science says we actually have to do. So I think that has to have a central place in the movement, as it increasingly does, I think. And as part of that agenda of how we actually win.
That's
Thank
great.
you so Thank you so much, Victoria. Sorry. You raised so many great points. Your generation has the most at stake, which makes the youth perspective and youth involvement so important. Now I'd like to welcome our second panelist, Jim Beatty. Jim came to the Okanagan from Montreal in 1975 as a farm worker, and since then has been a farmer, farm representative for government, and a farm worker advocate. Jim was elected to the BC legislature in 1992 and represented the Penticton area as MLA in the 1990s, also serving as chair of the Aboriginal Affairs Committee. As a member of the South Okanagan Environmental Coalition, he was active in ending the use of 2,4-D in Okanagan Lake and helped close the door on uranium mining exploration in BC. Jim has been concerned about the environment and passionate about climate action for many years, and 6 years ago helped to found our organization, First Things First Okanagan. He is the chair of First Things First, and he is our champion and our beacon. Thank you, Jim, for sharing your perspective with us tonight, and please go ahead.
Well, thanks very much, Sue. I really appreciate that introduction. And I want to thank Seth for being here this evening. It's really fantastic that you've written this book and that you're here to share your thoughts with us. And of course, Victoria is a person from Penticton, and First Things First has worked for quite a few years with Victoria on a number of events, including one of our symposia and just raising awareness with the student body at Penn High. So thanks very much for being here, Victoria. It's great to see you. I also want to thank Sue and Lori and Margaret for putting together this really fabulous First Things First series, this deep dive series. It's really getting a lot of compliments from a lot of people. It's stimulating, it's very interesting. I've been asked to talk about what we've been doing in the Okanagan, to talk about our climate efforts. And I want to say that it's been a really rewarding to work with First Things First over the last 5.5 years. And although we have sometimes felt that we've not done enough and we could have done better, I think the happy reality for us is that we have worked to, as creatively as possible, communicate the urgency of the climate crisis. And we've really literally touched thousands of people, residents in the Okanagan. And we've offered people at the same time opportunities to get involved in the climate movement. One thing that we're doing currently is with our newsletter, which we reach 600 individuals every month. So as a result of our efforts, I mean, we really have seen people take on the challenge of reducing their carbon footprint. And that's very encouraging. We've also worked hard to improve our relationship with municipalities. And we've been particularly successful in Penticton and Summerland. And we have a strong relationship with them. And it's great because when they show incentive, we've been able to support them. And sometimes when we feel that they've dropped the ball, we've been candid in our assessments. And sometimes we've been effective in turning things around. Board members of First Things First are all volunteers, and we're a working board. And under the banner of First Things First, we have and with our affiliate groups like Citizens Climate Lobby and the Climate Hub and Stop Site C organizations and others, we have lobbied city councilors, we've lobbied MLAs, we've lobbied MPs, we've walked in protests, and we've walked in encouragement. So we've been on the front line in all those areas, working with other activists across the province. When it comes to students and working with youth, the board has arranged for thousands of dollars over the last 3 or 4 years to fund the British Columbia Sustainable Energies Program, Cool It, a program that goes into local schools and helps young children understand how they too can work with their families. First Things First has hired a teacher to deliver that program. And even during this pandemic, we are continuing to build that program. In terms of talking about the technologies that are available, we've had 3 alternate energy symposia. Once, in fact, at the local high school, Penn High, in which Victoria was involved. And we've brought speakers into the schools. We've engaged students in music and art projects that are focused on the climate emergency. Students have worked in the past with First Things First, and even today we are working on a variety of projects with students in our area, Summerland and Penticton particularly. We are also very pleased that we've been able to work with the Penticton Indian Band and the Inalkin Center. In fact, Margaret mentioned the Inalkin Center with regards to that restoration project they're doing. And we've had a good relationship with both these organizations doing cultural events, particularly with the Inalkin Center. So, I mean, in the long run, I feel we've been engaged to our full potential as a completely volunteer organization with no staff. And, you know, working with a wonderful group of people has really kept me sane and helped me from getting too depressed over the issue that we're confronted with. Groups like First Things First Okanagan across BC and Canada are just doing a fantastic job educating their communities and initiating local action. But I gotta say, it's not enough. You know, as a result of working in the field for the last number of years with a great group of people, our understanding of the challenges of engaging the public and because of our understanding of the urgency of the problem, we know to be successful in this fight, as Seth is saying in his book, that we need the government to get serious about this crisis and to move quickly as the science demands. A Good War really strongly resonated with me, Seth, and I was really able to just read that book in only a few sittings. And based on the historic success you outlined, it's a concrete and it's a well-researched plan. A good war could be effective in binding the passions of citizens and the regulations of government to this urgent common cause. Seth, you have done the legwork of articulating how it would work, and there is really nothing that I could add that I would ever presume to add to the concept. You've covered it so well. But I do sense that there is a challenging, potentially hostile landscape that lay between the vision and the implementation. You have listed organizations and individuals who could be leaders and allies in helping to initiate this ambitious, doable project. But it's unclear at this point whether these individuals and organizations are able or even want to be champions of the idea at this point. So that is what I'd like to address with you. My question is about climate NGOs across the country. Seth, do you believe that climate NGOs of all sizes should form one nationwide coalition, set aside other projects, and unite around the single cause of bringing great pressure on governments across the country to adopt the Good War proposal? Can you envision the establishment of one umbrella organization with regional representation, coordinating education campaigns, rallies, and marches, to mobilize support for this bold plan?
Thanks, Jim. And it's really impressive what's happening in your neck of the woods. And it's great to know that you're doing all that work. And those of you who are doing it should know you're in good company. Like, as you're alluding to, there are groups like yours in every community in the country doing stuff like this, and in every country in the world. I mean, that's part of this moment that we're in, where we all wonder, you know, we're just little Canada. What does it matter if we're doing all? And the truth is, I mean, there's an element to all of this that's a leap of faith, and we just have to do it knowing that millions of other people of goodwill are doing the same thing where they are. Do they all need to unite in a single organization? I don't think so, actually. I mean, collaboration is always a good thing. And I think there are lots of environmental groups that could do a better job. We could all do a better job of supporting each other better, and supporting each other's campaigns. There's a lot of groups where everyone's doing their campaign in their own silo. So I mean, maybe this is a good segue to say, I want to spend the next few years trying to animate the ideas in the book, and I have just recently found a home for doing that. David Suzuki and Tara Cullis gave me a home. So I'm now launching something called the Climate Emergency Unit as a project of the David Suzuki Institute, not the David Suzuki Foundation, but the Institute. So importantly, it's a nonprofit that doesn't have charitable status, because, as I think you were alluding to already, you know, there's all of these things we can do on a voluntary basis in our own communities, but big picture, this is a political project.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that has to happen outside what's allowed under the CRA charitable rules. My hope is that the little unit that I'm launching can be a convener of those other groups that are in an emergency mode to cooperate more and collaborate more. But I don't think we all need to be in the same formal organization. I think it's too hard, actually. But I do think we all need to cooperate in electing bigger squads of true climate emergency champions across a number of political parties and at multiple levels of government. And I do hope that people will pick up ideas in the book around these 4 markers that I'm talking about. You know, that is a framework for engaging every level of government, and in fact, any large organized institution, including a university or what have you, around, are you serious about this? Because if you get emergency, these are the 4 markers if you know that an institution or government is actually in emergency mode. And I'm happy to say that I think lots of people are really resonating with it. It feels like what I'm proposing landed at the right moment, where I think a lot of groups are realizing that we need to try something different because what we've been trying isn't working.
So Seth, as a follow-up to that question and your answer, in your book, you also refer to a citizens' assembly. It seems to me that a citizens' assembly is anathema to a government. And so, I mean, I know it has been used in some countries, but not a great deal of countries, and the mandate that it might have could be quite thin. I'm wondering, do you think that it should be an effort of the climate movement to work at establishing a citizens' assembly, or do you think it has to come from government?
Well, I think the pressure for them is coming from civil society, but ultimately it's governments that need to empower them to actually have a say. I mean, interestingly, the call for citizen assemblies has become one of the centerpiece calls of Extinction Rebellion. And I think they're right about that. Because here's the thing, there's certain things that aren't up for debate. We need to hit these ambitious climate targets. That can't be up for debate.
Right.
There's multiple paths for achieving that. And there's ways of achieving it with justice, and there's ways of achieving it without justice.
Mm-hmm.
And the people want to say, and they're right to want to say. So the example that I give Here's why I think governments might be open to it. And incidentally, in Ireland and the UK and some other places, they are empowering citizen assemblies on the climate question. Partly, I think they're doing it because the citizen assemblies sometimes give them cover to do bolder things than the politicians alone are willing to consider or get behind. And we have our own British Columbia experience with this. The Citizens Assembly on Electoral Reform in the 90s, which was frankly, not the 90s, the early 2000s, which was the one really great thing I thought Gordon Campbell did. And what's interesting about that is, for those of you who remember the first referendum that came out of that, is the public is prepared to take the advice of their fellow citizens in a way that they aren't always prepared to do with their elected politicians. I just think I think it's a worthwhile tool. Do I think it's the end all and be all and sort of essential? No, but I think it's helpful.
Thank you, Seth. I'll now encourage people to, if they have any questions, I've been monitoring it, to put them in the chat. We do have time for just a couple. I'm going to start with one, which is, we hear that we may be in a federal election this year. What's the most important question to ask candidates? Well, maybe candidates at the local level and also leaders.
Well, I think the challenge for all of us is to recapture that momentum that we had before the pandemic, right? That student day of action, led student day of action, was incredible. There was pretty close to 1 million Canadians on the street. Now that's a pretty good percentage of the population. Like, you're starting to hit major societal turning point with that. And the politicians all saw it, right? I mean, a month after that day, we had a federal election where climate was one of, if not the defining issues. And I think the students get credit for that. So we're going to need to try to recapture that. I do hope, what I identify in the book is that I don't think the main challenge we're facing is kind of old school climate denial, the kind we just saw expressed at the Tory convention, at the Conservative convention. That's a diminishing rump of public opinion. The much more widespread and insidious challenge is the new climate denialism, which is political leaders who say they accept the science and yet continue to pursue a policy agenda that doesn't align with what that science says we have to do. And to greater and lesser extents, all of our political parties do some of that. So we need to be pressing them for a true climate emergency program. We don't have one in BC. We don't have one federally. That should be part of what we bring to nomination fights, and that should be part of trying to identify true climate champions who get it, who are in it to win it. Those people are out there. I mean, I think the last BC election, I'm someone who believes in minority governments. I dearly want to see another minority government federally. And so in the BC election, I would have preferred a minority, but I do think we elected more climate champions in this legislature than we had in the previous one. They need to be supported and bolstered to be daring and bold. And federally, we have a growing squad across a few political parties, and we need more of them. And if we can produce another minority outcome, we increase the ability of those squads to make a difference.
Great, thank you. Somebody has asked for a quick assessment of the new Canadian climate plan.
So in December, we got an updated federal plan with a long list of measures, but really it's the centerpiece of it was a doubling down on the carbon tax and the schedule to increase the carbon tax to $170 a ton by the year 2030. I'm not opposed to that. I like carbon pricing. It bothers me that it becomes the sole centerpiece of it, and the kind of how that that then sucks up all the oxygen and becomes the debate over something that can't in itself achieve what we need to achieve. And we've seen this movie. This is the movie we've been watching for the last 20 years. It's a bad movie. So, you know, if you, when I gave my assessment of the Trudeau government and the 4 markers, I was already incorporating what we got in December. So are they spending what they need to spend? No, they're spending 10 times less than they need to be spending. Are they creating new economic institutions? No, they are not. I see no sign of those. Are they moving to from voluntary to mandatory measures? A little bit on the margins, but not nearly at the scale that we need. Are they telling the truth? No, they are not telling the truth about what we have to do. So we still lack a climate emergency plan. It's an improvement over what we had before, and it's not an emergency plan. I do think today's Supreme Court decision in defense of the carbon pricing is really welcome news. Less so because of its defense of carbon pricing, although I'm happy for that, as much as something else important happened today. The majority of the court made clear that climate is an overriding threat, and as an overriding threat, it is in fact federal jurisdiction to lead. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, for decades, one of the things holding us back is people saying, well, the feds can't do what's provincial jurisdiction, or the feds themselves are afraid that if they tried something, they'll be stymied by the provinces. And now the court has actually said to the feds, no, you lead. That's your job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think you've given us some marching orders for talking to candidates and asking more of our politicians and of our government. Thank you very much, Seth, for your talk. I think we'll be mulling over this. And actually, I'm a member of a Good War book club. We're going to be giving away one of your books. And I encourage everyone, this is a very worthwhile read. It's historical. You learn about World War II, and you also learn about how that applies to us now. So go to your library, order it online, go to your bookstore, please get a Good War. It's a very worthwhile, very readable book. So
Margaret, can I say one last thing out of that World War II piece I like to leave people with? Everyone on this call is already engaged in the climate fight. And so the thing that we all have in common is, because we aren't afraid to look at what the science says, is we wrestle with despair. Mm-hmm. We live in an ambiguous time. We don't know if we're going to do what we need to do in time. That is the simple truth. There's no false hope about that. We just don't know. But the one thing I like to recall out of that World War II story, I mentioned before, out of the population of 11 million, over 1 million of them enlisted. You know what they didn't know? They didn't know if they would win. And they did it anyway. So that's what we have to do.
Thank you. Thank you again, Seth. We are, as I say, if you want to get a chance to get as a gift Good War, please just email info@firstthingsfirstokanagan.com. We'll put it in the chat. And give us a takeaway from this evening. What are your thoughts on Seth's conversation? And you'll get randomly selected to win a copy of the book. But I do encourage you to get your own copy as well. Mm-hmm. I have just a few housekeeping things. So Seth, if you'd like to get back to your family, you're welcome to do so. You're also welcome to stay.
Say goodbye, everyone.
Okay.
And thank you, Victoria and Jim.
Okay. Thank you so much. It was really inspirational.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
So this is deep dive number 6. We are working on one more before we take a break for the summer. I think April, since it's growing season, we'll probably be doing something on agriculture or food waste, sustainability, something like that. So stay tuned. If you don't get our newsletter, you can put your name in the chat to subscribe if you'd like to. You can also save the chat at the bottom. There's a lot of useful links there. At the bottom of the chat, you'll see 3 dots. And if you click on that, you'll be able to save the whole thing as a file that you can look at later. And that, I think, is about all. I encourage you to come out and support First Things First through the events that we promote in our newsletter. But that's, I hope you've enjoyed tonight's discussion. And you can also check out our Facebook page where we have all of our events there as well. And if you want to talk to your neighbor about this and they weren't able to make it, or your partner or friend, we will send you the link to our YouTube channel where we will have this so you can watch it again or share it with someone else. So thanks very much for joining us here this evening, and we'll say good night.
Thank you to everyone.